So please welcome Gabe Klein.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. It's great to be in Milwaukee. This is only my second time in Milwaukee, and I don't know if you guys have gotten out, but it is just an amazing place, including the trail network here on the water. I want to talk today about the intersection in 15 minutes. Normally I do like 45 minutes to an hour, but in 15 minutes on land use, mobility, technology in America, and taking a human-centered approach, and why we can sort of create win-win-wins, not to sound cliche, but create places that are equitable and sustainable and healthy in the future. But first, I really think we should ask ourselves these fundamental questions. What kind of city do we want to live in? Which we often don't ask. We make decisions based on politics, whoever screams the loudest sometimes. What kind of infrastructure do we need for this future? And why are our policies often at odds with our needs, and therefore our budget often at odds with our needs? So let's talk quickly about some of the challenges that we face. Now, this is not meant to be a political slide or a partisan slide, but it is meant to reflect that we are in an era of significant uncertainty, particularly at the city and to a certain extent at the state level. We don't know what's going to happen next. There's been talks about going from 80% federal and 20% local match funding to 20% federal and 80% local match overnight. We're reneging on the Paris Climate Accords. There's a lot of stuff changing. And look, we've been in gridlock at the federal level for the last 7 or 8 years, so this is not completely new. But the point of this is to say we need to rely on ourselves at the local level, at the city level, the regional level, and at the state level to get things done. The other challenge we have is pollution. This is actually a picture in Beijing in 2008, before the Olympics, and then during the Olympics, when we decided to idle factories, ask people not to drive their cars, not we, but the Chinese government. And people say, well, government policy isn't really that important. It's really what the businesses are deciding to do. No, this is government policy, driving the change in business in a stark visual way that you can see. And for the first time since 1980, in 2016, we saw that transportation is the #1 emitter of CO2. Okay, so it's not power plants anymore that's #1 or buildings, it's actually transportation. So all eyes are on transportation. The other thing we don't want to talk about is that the biggest health crisis that we have in the United States and worldwide, not Zika virus, it's vehicle deaths, it's crashes. And it's getting worse. When gas is cheaper, when cars are cheaper, we drive more and we have more crashes. And people are also distracted behind the wheel. So we have a real problem there. And we have a problem with the intersection of active transportation and SUVs and the unfair advantage that the cars have and the death toll that it creates, and injuries, by the way. So, trying to sum this up, around the turn of the last century, our streets were really for people. They were for commerce. People lived on top of each other everywhere, which tends to cause things like entrepreneurship, but also tolerance of people that look different than you or are from a different place than you are. And now, we've really moved to this. And this is a problem because it creates separatism, creates unhappiness, pollution, and it's bad for business. So, with that, let's talk about what's happening now as we change from this suburban mindset that we've had for the last 75 years, and we start to re-urbanize, which is what we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years, depending on where you live. This is a picture from Hachiko Square in Tokyo. I was there a few months ago. And that is the busiest Starbucks in the world on the north side, because 2,300 people cross at a red light. So more people, more congestion, more business. When it's people, people like congestion. When it's cars, they don't like congestion. Now, the other thing you see happening, particularly in Asia, is they spend 8 to 9% of GDP on infrastructure and transportation. Europe spends 5 to 6%. Who knows how much we spend? 2 to 3%. That's what we used to spend. I don't know what we're going to spend this year. So we are being lapped by competitor nations and continents that are building transit and trails and active transportation ways at an incredible speed, including, in this case, building an entire transit station in 9 hours with 1,500 workers. That would take probably 2 years in most of our cities to build it, probably another 10 to plan it. Behind the scenes, we're seeing a culture shift. So we've been on the planet 200,000 years. We've been walking, riding horses, doing a lot of different things, not driving except for the last 75. So we are moving from this time of hyper-consumption where everybody wants to own their own pool and white picket fence and 7 televisions and 2 cars, to collaborative consumption where kids coming out of school not only can't afford to own all that stuff with $100,000 worth of college debt on average, but they don't want to. They have a cell phone, they want to hang out with their friends. Everything is more experiential. Now with that in the background, you look at what's happening in Europe, where people aren't getting licensed. They aren't driving cars because they've taken this approach towards transit, walking, biking, that is about making it completely frictionless, physically and virtually. So I took this picture of, in the airport, of that card that you can get for like 80 kroner, I think is the money that they use there. And you get unlimited transportation on any mode. You get unlimited access to museums. You get access to the amusement park in the center of Copenhagen. But then also when you go to take your bike from the trail onto the train, you can go all the way to Sweden with your bike. So it's about making it really easy for people to make the right choices. Now in the US, we're struggling even with the concept of induced demand. So we think, hey, there's a congestion problem, meaning it's taking a long time to get through in your car. We got to build an extra lane. Cities are finally saying, no. The solution is actually counterintuitive. We got to take the lanes away. That's the only way that you create change. You got to let people make different choices. People are smarter than we give them credit for, and they will make better choices. So we are finally seeing we're seeing people saying we don't want to spend on more freeways. We want to invest in our future. We want to build the trail network. We want to build bike lanes on the street. We want to build light rail. And people are figuring out that a negative ROI on building an extra highway lane like they've been trying to do in Tampa for a few years at the cost of $9.3 billion, tearing out 140 homes, a bunch of businesses, is different than spending $9.3 billion on a citywide light rail or a trail network or a bike lane network, where you actually see the dividends. You see the return in lots of different ways: sustainability, health, and raw dollars. But if we can't get our heads around ROI and cost-benefit analysis, then how are we going to start to do what Canada does and actually look at the fully loaded societal cost-benefit, where they figured out that to build walking and biking infrastructure is profitable if you take into account sustainability and health, amongst other things, right? We tend to think even that transit is a sinkhole of cost. It's a social program, right? You build it, then you got to pay to operate it. Well, first of all, in Hong Kong and Singapore, where a critical number of people use it, a critical mass, it's profitable. They also plan their land use with their transportation. But even in America, busing, or in North America, I should say, is 6 times cheaper than the subsidy for the personally owned automobile, because we subsidize all of that, but we just think of it as a sunk cost, building these roads, buying more cars. I have to do it. Therefore, we don't look at the fact that it costs individuals $1,000 a month and that we don't even have the money to maintain these roads in our government. Okay, so let's talk about what's coming. All this great stuff. It's all completely automated. You can get a Chipotle burrito instantly through this drone. It's going to be amazing. I'm actually very pro-technology. I love it if it's a tool used for the right outcomes. Otherwise, it can be disastrous. So let's talk about these new mobility trends, but we're only going to talk about them for like 30 seconds. So we have electric and autonomous vehicles coming. They have to be shared. If they aren't shared, we have failed, and we will have more traffic on our roads. Active transportation needs to be a key part of the equation. It needs to be talked about every time we talk about all this technology. And by the way, scooters and shared bikes are taking over our cities, and I think that's a wonderful thing. Co-creation, public and private coming together to figure out what the business model should be and what the solutions should be, whether they be trail networks or whether they be services. And then, of course, the data. We need to get the data so that we can plan better for the future. So this is one idea for what the future could look like with transit, where we basically curate people's experience from the time they wake up till they go to sleep, and they've got food at every interval, and artificial intelligence and machine learning it's predicting what people want when they get off, and so on and so forth, right? So this is one vision of what the convergence of those services could be. But let's put that to the side, because really it's a bit of a distraction. What we care about are what are the outcomes for people. And so in this future world where cars, Keith and I, we were just talking, 10 years ago, I think I said to him, cars sit 95% of the time, and now we have an opportunity where literally, like Waymo is saying that the cars will be active 95% of the time, the autonomous electric shared vehicles. So that's a complete flip. And in DC, where I live, 88% of new people moving to the district, and this is a 4-year-old number, are not bringing a car or buying a car. So you can imagine 95% of people in an autonomous world. So what does that mean for our streets? It means that we could take road space and we could make it trail space, right? Literally trails on our streets. Grade separated like they have in Europe, grassy green if we want them to be, whatever we want. We have this opportunity, but we've got to paint the picture for people. We've got to have this vision. We've got to work across all socioeconomic strata. Like there's a lot that has to be done to get there, but we can do it. Here's an image from Jerry Tierney at Perkins and Will suggesting what a street, 40th Avenue in San Francisco, could look like in the future. So imagine if we also built more density and more affordable housing and more workforce housing. We took our parking off-street, our structured parking, which is up to 25% of urban areas, and we made it into housing for people instead of storage for cars. It could be a great future. Now, in places like in Europe, where they've already announced the EU is going to ban cars in their downtowns by 2050, people don't care so much about the autonomous car. It's not that big a deal. Although we're thinking there about autonomous buses and autonomous shuttles and bikes and walking. And by the way, when you do that, you lower people's total cost of living in a city. We have people in DC, particularly in Southeast, spending up to 53% of their income to have a car because they live in a transit desert, right? So we can fix these things in the future utilizing good solid planning and technology. In places like Barcelona, they're saying, well, wait a second, how do we just get rid of 60% of traffic in our cities? That sounds like a pretty grand experiment. But what they've figured out is if you can limit traffic to the arterial streets and not let it into the neighborhoods, but there's a change management piece to this. So to get people used to it, what if you just ban left turns when you turn into a neighborhood? Pretty simple idea. So if you turn into your neighborhood or into somebody's neighborhood, you have to immediately turn right back out. That makes it not very plausible to drive your car through somebody's neighborhood. So that's phase one. Phase two, you eliminate all through traffic unless somebody lives there, and you allow biking, and you allow transit services and deliveries. They're experimenting with that now. So all these experiments are very important. Now, I love the Kubler-Ross model because it's the original change management model. It's about death, basically. I know I'm supposed to be uplifting people in this closing session, but it's about death, and then it's about rebirth. It's about experimenting, trying new things, getting excited through trial usage, figuring out what you can mainstream, and then making decisions and integrating it into your future. So I think we're right at the experimental phase, and people are starting to get a little bit more excited. Okay, so how do we get where we need to go? So when I ran the Chicago Department of Transportation, the DC department, there's a couple people in here, like Heather, that worked with me. We set really aggressive goals. So I came from the private sector. I came from a startup world. I was with Zipcar as an executive and like very long ago. And I knew that if we didn't set aggressive goals, smart goals, we would never get things done. And you have a political time frame. You got 4 years in most places, or 2 years in some places. So we set 120 goals and metrics approximately that we committed to hit. We said we're going to put people first. And I thought we'd get a huge backlash from AAA and others. And we didn't. People were like, oh, how do you argue with putting people first? But for 75 years or so, we've been putting the automobile first because we haven't been calling out publicly what we're going to do, what we're going to focus on. We called out transit second because we're carrying over 1 million people, a lot of low-income people, and that's critical mass usage, and then cycling third. Then people like People for Bikes, Tactical Urbanism by Mike Clyde, all this stuff was coming together, and we're like, wait a second, not everything needs to be a $50 million project. You can try things. People, not everybody gets to go to Copenhagen, right, and see what they're doing. You got to show people stuff. And just telling people why they need to do things is not going to get the majority of people excited. So like that picture all the way on the left is an experiment in Chicago to make an intersection safer, but also to make it beautiful and fun and artistic. And so by showing people these changes, then you can institutionalize the change internally and get the public excited about it. Now then there are the big projects, right? Like Clyde Warren Park in Dallas, which took the place where nobody wanted to be in Dallas, nobody wanted to live there, and made it a place that everybody wanted to live, and now it's one of the nicer places in Dallas. It was $100 million raised between the public and the private sector, mostly, I think it was maybe all private sector funding. So the private sector and the public sector coming together are key. Or in Seoul, and I actually met the engineer who designed this. They took this multi-level, double-decker, super polluted area of the city and converted it into this biophilic, beautiful, active trail and river and park. I mean, if you can do that, you can do anything. That's amazing. And now, everybody wants to live there, right? So I got to work on the Bloomingdale Trail, which people have been talking about since 1998. There were a lot of community activists who were very excited. I got there in 2011. My boss, Rahm Emanuel, said, we're going to build this. And then he threw it to me and said, go figure it out. And by the way, we don't have any money. So we worked with the Trust for Public Land to raise money. We took money from the state, the county. We basically begged, borrowed, and stole to build this trail. And the mayor also said, we said, well, what's the timeline? He said, 4 years. He said, I want to be able to ride on it by the end of my term. And we're like, well, that's not possible. And he's like, you're going to do it. And that's important, that kind of leadership. He also said he would support us. But that type of leadership is important to get things done. And so we took this abandoned Canadian Pacific rail line with 37 bridges that were falling apart, a Metro rail facility, 525 people had built onto the trail. So we needed 525 easements. And there were a host of pocket parks, and we needed to get the transitions right to the transportation system and install bike share and rehab the CTA stations. 4 years later, it was done, and the mayor got to ride on it. So these things can be done. I particularly love when people say things can't be done. They're like, oh, there's a poor neighborhood over here, and you're going to link it to this lily-white neighborhood over here. That's going to be hard, and all these easements are going to be hard. Well, we did link 5 neighborhoods together that are totally different. There was a dearth of public space. It was a lot of work, but we got it done. It can be done. And the money was never a problem. People always say, well, how are you going to get the money? How are you going to figure that out? I've never had money stop me from being able to do a project. It's always the other stuff. It's inertia. It's lack of public support. You have to attack those issues. And we got it done, and now people are enjoying it and loving it and intermingling. And I just think it's an excellent project. And it took a village to build that. It was not just me. It was it was hundreds of people. The Chicago Riverwalk was another project that we spearheaded. My staff came to me, and I talk about it in my book, and they said, hey, we think we can. We'd built out a couple blocks over 10 years. There was like a war memorial. They said, we think we can make this beautiful. We need $1 million in funding to do the conceptual design. So we stole $1 million from another project, stuck it over there, did the design, didn't tell anybody. And then we started talking to DOT about a $99 million TIFIA loan. We put the project in front of the mayor at the last minute. He loved it. We were able to score the money in 8 months due to a wonderful CFO for the city. The fastest they'd ever done a loan like that was 18 months. And in 28 months from conception to starting the construction, we went to work, and we created CPS classrooms. There are kids in Chicago that have never been downtown, never seen the river. We created spaces for everybody. We also created a sustainable business model. And now people are enjoying it. And there's 8 different blocks, and each one is a different concept and different room. But in a nutshell, the tour boat operators, they had year-to-year leases, and they're making a lot of money, but they could make a lot more money. So we started talking to them. We said, what would you need to pay like triple to quadruple what you're paying now in rent? First, their faces turned white. Then they said, look, if we get 15-year leases, so we could actually recapitalize our boats, if we could have the opportunity to expand, we would pay 3 to 4x. That paid for the Riverwalk. So the finance director for the city, please don't tweet this, told me this can't be done. It's going to suck the last bit of money we have out of the city. Don't do it. Don't get the mayor excited about this. It's throwing off a profit to the city. Every dollar that goes through there, some of it goes to the city. So if we have outreach to the private sector and we work together, we can get these big projects done. We can get them done fast. So go check out the Chicago Riverwalk. I just want to say also, we're doing a bunch of work around cities as platforms and preparing cities for the future, but also thinking of them as data as a service, mobility as a service, infrastructure as a service. This is in Los Angeles. My partner, Ashley Hand, is working on this. One of the most interesting things that's come out of this is this idea of transportation happiness. So everybody wants to get from here to there as fast as humanly possible. What about the quality of the trip? If you're riding on the Bloomingdale Trail or the Lakefront Trail in Chicago or the Lakefront Trail here to get to work, the quality of the trip is probably more important. How do you feel when you get to work? How healthy are you, right? And so we need to start thinking about talking in these terms, which ties into what our friends in Europe talk about. They don't talk about GDP as much, gross domestic product. We do. They talk about total happiness index. And GDP is a percentage of that. But social support is important. Health, freedom of choice. So we are 18th. By the way, that's my daughter buying her first pair of shoes that she picked up, using the public space to celebrate. But look at the quality of the infrastructure and the transportation network and the active transportation network in almost every one of those countries versus ours. And there's a connection. And in the US, we're just starting to look at this. And it's not the biggest places that are the happiest. It's the places typically that have great outdoor space and great trail networks, including my hometown of Washington, D.C., with the W&OD Trail and many, many, many others. So to make this change, we got to really define what our values are. Then we can work down to what the resources are that we need. There are some cases where we really want to drive the change ourselves, and there's some cases where the private sector is doing a lot of work and we can just shape it in the way that we want. But what we can't do is do nothing, because the head-in-the-sand approach results in a lot of cool technology coming and a lot of people being displaced by it in lots of different ways. So we need to drive that change, and we need to remember the Kubler-Ross Model when we're doing it. And in closing, the good news and the bad news is we have to make this change. We absolutely have to do it. I have kids. Some of you probably do too. If we want our kids to be able to have kids, we have this sort of one chance in time to make change and to create places where people are happy versus always thinking about how we're going to move people long distances. They should be riding their bikes and walking 50% of the time, and then shared transportation 50% of the time. Thank you.
Thank you.